Will Larson encourages us to be easy on ourselves and say, hey, this might have been the right strategy at the time, but as it's gone on, it's no longer the right strategy. And we talk about that with code. You say software engineering is code over time and systems evolve, and we tried to do the best we could. But isn't there like a lot of cope in that?
Today's sponsor is Mailtrap, modern email delivery for developers. The complete email API that does everything you need to do. Try today at mailtrap.io.
Hey there, this is Book Overflow, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, make sure to like, comment, subscribe wherever you're at. Join our Discord. The link for that is in the episode description. We actually just passed 12,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is pretty neat. And another fun little YouTube milestone. Our latest video with Carl Brown is actually now our second most popular video on YouTube. Dethroned Martin Fowler, which we were texting Carl, and he was very happy about the company he was in. He was looking at his video. He's like, dang, like I'm up with Brian Kernahan, Martin Fowler, John Osterholt, Bob Martin. Brian Kernahan is still the number one, but who knows? Maybe Carl's coming from. Pretty fun milestones, huh, Nathan?
Yeah, pretty awesome. I love it that our guests, which were something we never imagined that people would actually become coming on our show.
We hope we get like maybe one or two.
Yeah, and I think we've gotten 22 authors over the like 40 plus books that we've read, which is a pretty amazing rate. Yeah. But there are overwhelmingly the most popular episodes typically, right? So yeah, we love it. It's something that's really enriching that we can bring to y'all. And I hope that we have many, many more.
It's funny. They are overwhelmingly the most popular episodes on YouTube, but our audio is much less consistent. We've seen our audio just tends to grow steadily week over week. YouTube, we get these very spiky, which makes sense. YouTube kind of lends itself more to virality.
And that's true. I mean, I guess it's, our podcast, which I love our podcast listeners. You're the most consistent folks who show up. I really appreciate that you're sharing your life with, you're letting us share our life with you, I guess. And yeah, it's a much more like the, I guess, newsletter sort of model where you accumulate an audience over time. And so, yeah, that's great. I think some of the best participants in our Discord are actually our podcast listeners. So,
yes.
I think we have a special relationship with those folks, and yeah, please keep listening.
Well, absolutely. And we're excited. Today we're going to do part 2 of 3 of Crafting Engineering Strategy by Will Larson. But before that, we actually have something more important we need to talk about, and this is not in the notes. I'm surprising Nathan with this right now. I must give my spoiler-free review of Project Hail Mary. Because I saw it. We're recording this on Friday. I actually got an early screening on Monday. You're going to hear this in a couple days on your Monday. Yeah, awesome. You guys, if you listen to the Project Hail Mary episode, I'm a big fan of the book. One of my favorite fiction books of all time. Very, very faithful adaptation. The few things they had to cut or tweak a little, I totally understand. There even a small change they made that I thought was better from the book than the movie. Still, overall, I like the book better. The most emotional parts of the book hit better in the book than in the movie. But Ryan Gosling kills it. Very fun, very funny, very heartwarming, and an excellent watch on the big screen. So from one of the biggest fans out there, big recommend. Go see Project Hail Mary in theaters. All right. And with that, let's talk about Crafting Engineering Strategy by Will Larson. Like I said, part 2 of 3. And this is actually really interesting. We'll have to, next week will be interesting because this is Will Larson. He does this in a lot of his books where the first half to 2/3 is the material. And then the back third or so is case studies or interviews. So Staff Engineer was interviews with a lot of staff engineers. And then this is case studies about how to kind of apply engineering strategies. So we finished out the material and read 2 of the case studies. And next week will be just case studies. Let's introduce you to Will Larson and the book, just in case you're listening to this for the first time. For Will Larson, our author introduction, we have Will Larson has been an engineering leader and software engineer at technology companies of many shapes and sizes, including Calm, Stripe, and Uber. He grew up in North Carolina, studied computer science at Center College in Kentucky, spent a year in Japan on the JET program teaching English, and has been living in San Francisco since 2009. He writes frequently on his blog, Irrational Exuberance, at lethane.com. And for a book introduction, we have good decisions are the core of creating software, and strategy is the art of reproducibly making good decisions. Crafting engineering strategy explains how you can improve your organization's decision making, both as an engineer or as an executive, grounding the approach in concrete examples from real companies. So, finished the quote unquote material, read some case studies. Nathan, give me your thoughts on our, I guess, part 2 of 3.
Yeah, so I was a little worried with the way that we're breaking this up because it gets into case studies. I was like, oh man, is next week also going to be all case studies? But actually, there's a closer. So I do
Okay, there we
think
go.
that, yeah, I didn't know. I was like reading over the chapters for this to prepare for this episode. Um, all I can say is this book delivers. So
Yeah.
we got through all of the major 5 sort of pieces of what he calls a good structure to, strategic planning and strategic thinking. And then this week we transition into all of these ideas on, okay, but what is your writing strategy and what is the goal of these parts? And it made it all make sense. And I think that's what I'm excited about talking about today. And then straight from that, he's like, hey, you're not going to learn all the way unless you see some like real world examples. And even I think it's 4 or 5 case studies that we touch on. They're different enough that even though you're reading someone's strategic planning inside of a company, I'm like, oh man, at this point in time, this really was a problem, and you really did need to take this new approach. And it's like, it's actually like if I was working at Uber at this time and we were trying to approach this type of problem, I would have felt in very good hands, right? And so I think that's where I was kind of not looking forward to the case study part. I'll be honest. I was like, got through this and I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna have to read. Well, we both were talking about this. We're like, okay, we have these like 2 case study chapters, and then they were just as easy to read as the other parts, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. And so I don't know. Yes. What about your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this was now our second Will Larson book. And Will Larson, I'm willing to say, is one of the most talented software engineering authors out there today. At least, as far as writing software engineering books. It's funny because we just read Project Hail Mary, which was written by a software engineer. And I actually picked up, based on our episode, did we mention this in the episode with Carl Brown? I think this just might have been us texting him. 3 Body Problem. You had recommended, Nathan.
Yes.
Or was that that was in the episode with Project Hail Mary?
I think you brought it up in the Project Hail Mary episode. Yeah.
And so I started reading that, which you pointed out is also a software engineer turned author. So I've been enjoying a lot of like fiction written by software engineers. And so I feel like I have to put that caveat, which is Will Larson, I love you, but I think Andy Weir's work, I'm a fan of more from a pleasure perspective. But as far as technical books, Will Larson kills it. He very, very talented. He makes writing look very easy. You read this and you're kind of like, why are you? What's so challenging writing a book like this? And then we've just read a lot of books, and we've read a lot of books by some very talented people, and it's tough. It's tough to write a book that flows as well as this one does. And I think a book like this, you write a book, you title it Crafting Engineering Strategy. So easy to make this very ivory tower, very theoretical. Will doesn't do that in the slightest. It's a very, very grounded. You can tell this comes from someone who has done this a lot and who takes it seriously. And the case studies that we read today just serve to, it only helps that point. It makes it go from, these are all my wonderful ideas about how one might craft engineering strategy, to, I've actually done this. Here are some examples of how I've done this in the past. And I think what you said, Nathan, is great. Like, if you were under his leadership, you'd feel like you were in good hands. And I think for anyone aspiring to be an engineering leader, that is the feeling you want to invoke most in your employees. And so this is the book. This is the book you got to read. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back with our full discussion. Okay, we're back. Let's talk let's talk about the book. We might go chapter by chapter, we might not. We can kind of just talk about what stood out to us the most. Nathan, why don't you start? Our first chapters, maybe 11 and 12, we've got writing readable engineering strategies and bridging theory and practice. That wraps up part 2 of the book. And then we enter part 3, refinement tools. Anything stand out to you here?
Yeah. I thought there's a couple of things. We definitely, and I'll tell you, we haven't talked about this too much in the episode, but we've back and forth have been like, oh, we got to put this in the backlog, this book on the backlog. There's one book, I think it was called Don't Make Me Think, which is a Peach Pit book. I knew of this book. And it's talking about how it's a Steve Krug. It's a classic book. I've heard of it. basically on user interface design. Like I shouldn't have to low cognitive load. The default correct thing should be completely obvious, which takes time. It takes a lot of time and energy. And he said, let's see, the ideal format for this first case is generally at odds with the other two, which is frequently the reason why strategy documents struggle to graduate from brainstorming to policy. And I think he's talking about the transition. I guess I need to give a little context. Writing structure inhibits reading, right? So he goes into this idea that like if the discovery and all these refinement and the whole process that you do to construct a good strategy, you typically need to invert that structure for the reader. So like while we go through these discrete, exploration phase, diagnostics, refinement, the way you present it in writing is actually inverse. You really want the TLDR where you say, hey, here's our policy. Like, here's how we're going to execute. And then you justify it. Okay, we did these things. And you go through, and he makes this really good argument. And again, you can see that this is probably a glimpse of how his writing is so good. He probably does this really structured way of getting all of his thoughts together and then goes through this sort of like refactoring phase where he said, I'm going to invert this so that the value that I've refined out of this goes first. And I don't think this is focused on enough, right? Like he inverting the document structure for reading. And he basically says it should be, it's not a full inversion, right? So the order that we build a strategy, and we talked about this last week, is there's an exploration phase, there's a diagnostic phase, you refine your findings, you talk about policy, which is like the things that are, what does the strategy require or allow? And then the operational part. What he recommends for the writing the document, so for the reader, is that you do policy first, then talk about operations, then you justify all this with your refinement, diagnostics, and exploration. So it's sort of like it's an almost complete flip where policy and operations stay in the correct order, but at the very top. And I'll tell you, after we read the case studies later, this is absolutely correct. This is absolutely the correct way of doing it. And yeah, I thought it was completely justifiable. At first I was like, I mean, maybe that sounds fine, but no, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I really like the distinction he makes between academic writing and professional writing. Basically saying, how does he describe academic writing? He says, academic essays present evidence to support a clear thesis and generally build an argument forward toward a conclusion. Some business consultancies train their new hires in business writing, blah, blah, blah. Says, while academic essays want to develop an argument, professional writing is a bit different. Professional writing is typically has one of three distinct goals: refine thinking about a given approach, seeking approval from stakeholders or executives, or communicating a policy to your organization. And he says the ideal format for the first case is generally at odds with the other two. Mm-hmm. And that goes exactly what you're talking about, Nathan, with this idea of like inverting it. And when you're reading the case studies, he is saying that he's like, hey, like if you want to understand what the strategy is and like the high level, like start at the beginning. But if you want to understand the thinking that led to the strategy, go reverse. Do I have that backwards? No, that's correct, right?
I think that sounds right. And yeah, if it's not, right, roast us in the comments, right?
Yeah, roast us in the comments. Come on, guys. Hey, we read the book.
Yeah, and the other justification on this too, he goes, zooming out a bit, there's a classic lack of user empathy problem. The document's authors are so deep in the details that they can't put themselves in the reader's shoes. And I think this is that curse of knowledge thing, right? Mm-hmm. Once you become a domain expert, even if it's just from a small research spike, and you've seen this, right? You've probably done this in a meeting. You've probably been in a meeting where somebody's talking so over your head, so abstractly, that you've no freaking clue what they're talking about. And you're like, that sounds right, but it's, and so it really is from a user empathy standpoint, you need concrete ways of justifying, hey, I'm arguing that this policy is the best policy. Now that might ruffle some feathers, and it's okay. If they lean forward and they go, oh my gosh, finally someone's saying the quiet part out loud, or we really need to do this, or they might viscerally respond and be like, this is a disastrous idea. There's no way it's going to work. If you can get that level of engagement, you're going to get someone to read the rest of your document, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you start soft with the exploration phase, you're like, oh, well, here's all the domain of problems and here's all the things that we have. Like, no, if you've gotten somebody to get through accepting or rejecting policy, accepting or rejecting the operational side of it, then they're going to want to dig in, either to build a thesis for why you're so wrong. They're going to look, oh, your exploration is completely flawed. You didn't even think about this. You didn't, like, that's great. It's the kind of engagement you want. And so, yeah, I really, and again, I'll bring it back to the case studies. It's funny. One of the case studies was like an Uber case study on how they can do self-service because they're growing so quickly. I think they were doubling the software engineering team every
like
6
service
months.
provisioning.
Yes. The thing is that, and we'll talk about this with Wardley Maps later, but everything in the software cycle, we're trying to get towards commoditization, right? Commoditization is literally stuff that's just so obvious that you don't have to put in a bunch of engineering effort. You take something off the shelf, right? Most organizations are not going to build data center infrastructure with an abstract API. You're going to go get a cloud provider. So AWS or Google Cloud is commodity at this point, right? You just kind of table stakes, you get Terraform. But if you go back to where Uber was solving these problems back when they were doing it, they were like, oh, well, there's this emerging trend with Kubernetes, and here's Mesos, and here's all that. And it was not a solved problem. Meaning, if they wanted to use some of these cool patterns, they actually had to build custom software to do these cool things. And like, yes, they were correct strategically, but from the execution standpoint, they had to do like special stuff. They had to write this whole strategy document as to justify why this was the trend of where things are. And you look at it now and you're like, this is so easy, right? Like you just, it's a few, if you're going to even do click ops on Google Cloud or AWS, you literally just like turn on a Kubernetes cluster and do a few things. But I loved this because again, it gives you this like little time capsule. You can like travel back in time and see how an engineering team was trying to approach a problem. And anyway, surprisingly fun to read for me.
Yeah, I appreciate these kinds of like not retrospectives necessarily, but like you said, traveling back in time. I even had that thought when we were reading his biography. It says he's lived in San Francisco since 2009. I don't know when he kind of broke into the tech industry, if that was in 2009 or if maybe he had worked elsewhere and then moved to San Francisco. But I thought like, wow, 2009, like that's right, kind of in the thick of the recession, moving to San Francisco, like interesting. Like I'm not familiar enough with like what big tech culture was like back at the time. I know it wasn't as impacted by the recession as some other industries, but
I have a glimpse. Even though I wasn't working in Silicon Valley, my sister, my little sister is like 7 years younger than me, so she's in her mid 30s at this point, and she had just gotten into San Francisco Art Institute. And I'd go visit her, and I would go to conferences and stuff from time to time. So I actually got to see the glimpse of what Silicon Valley and San Francisco in like 2010 period, 2009, 2010, 2011, the transformation of getting out of the recession and the sort of abundance that was in place, right? Twitter started in 2007. If I think that's about,
that's roughly it.
2006, 2007, I think it became more, at least more ubiquitous. But there was like an excitement and a youth and like obviously there were still like problems that cities have, but it's a very different vibe than it is now.
Oh, interesting.
And so like I don't know, there was like at least my experience of it. And again, I was in like my my early to mid 20s, so maybe that was coloring it as well. No children, all this stuff. But what a cool time to go to San Francisco is I guess what I mean. Like the upside of that, money was free. All these startups, these unicorns are popping up, and he got to work at a decent number of them. And so like, it's really kind of cool because these companies were shaping. So there's the big tech companies like the FANG, and obviously they're setting a lot of the agenda of values as far as how you do stuff, right? Like Kubernetes came out of Google, but lots of really important projects, open source projects, were spinning up out of Dig and Uber and Yelp, and all these like companies were making these open source projects and kind of like giving engineers a way of expressing ways that you could build stuff in public. And I don't know, there's just a lot. I just remember a lot of like kind of cool things popping up all the time. And so getting a glimpse on this side of being like, oh wait, there was a strategic plan under the hood to kind of think about this was cool.
Well,
this fits. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna. You go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say this actually is a nice like bridge. The next chapter is called Bridging Theory and Practice, and again, this chapter happened exactly when it needed to. It's like, hey, everything up to this point has been pretty ivory tower, right? Like, okay, we have this formal process. This is how you write a good one, and then he's like, um, there's a lot of stuff on things like writing definitive documents or doing strategy despite unrealistic timelines, which is like what every startup you've ever been in, right? Or
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and so there's a really good advice on like, hey, what's the right level of touch? Like, how formal do I get, or how do I evolve this thing as we're, you know, you're in a chaotic environment, or you're trying to form strategy but you're not an executive, right? Like there's all these like kind of crazy things, and it's just real good practical documented, just stuff in this section.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that, where he talks about using strategy as a non-executive, because I had mentioned last week, I'm like, I think you can only do as much strategy as your boss will allow. And you had kind of pushed back and said, well, I don't know about that. I just want to quote verbatim here because I love these couple paragraphs. It says, some engineers will argue that the only valid strategy altitude is the highest one, the executive level, because any other strategy can be invalidated by a new higher altitude strategy. They claim teams simply cannot do strategy because executives might invalidate it. Some engineering executives argue the same thing, claiming they can't work on an engineering strategy because the missing product strategy or business strategy might introduce new constraints. I don't agree with this line of thinking at all. To do strategy at any altitude, you have to come to terms with the certainty that new information will show up and you'll need to revise your strategy to deal with it. When it comes to using strategy, effective diagnosis trumps authority. At least as many executive strategies are ravaged by reality's pervasive details as are overridden by higher altitude strategies. The only way to be certain your strategy will fail is to wait until you're certain that no new information might show up. And I really like this. It kind of reminds me of Made to Stick, where they say like they list like all the traits that make a story sticky. And they say, so do you have to come up with these stories? And they say, no, you need to be good at spotting them in the wild and then using them effectively. I kind of think about that. It's a little similar here, where one of the advantages you have if you're at a lower level is you are just closer to the action. And when he says effective diagnosis overrides, any sort of planning or strategy writing, I think if you're closer to the action, and particularly if you're most concerned with the needs of your team, the strategy you will try to implement for your team is going to be hopefully more effectively diagnosed than strategy that comes from a much higher level. Now, there are some things you just can't change. If your organization has decided that you have a TypeScript monolith and you must live in the TypeScript monolith, like any sort of local team strategy to break you out of the monolith might not apply, right? But if there are strategies about, more effective testing or incident resolving or how to handle on-call responsibilities, anything like that probably can be handled more effectively at a local level because you can diagnose it more effectively.
Yeah, I think that it's like to say that you can't do this unless you have this perfect environment is a cope, right? I think he makes a really
Right.
compelling case for this, and again worded it much better. My instinct was that, hey, I actually I disagreed with your assessment last week, but I didn't have the clarity of thought or the expression or the experience that Will Larson has had, and I think he makes a really nice argument that you you will never have enough information. There's always going to be new information that's coming in that changes what's going on. And so learning how to craft engineering strategies in this constantly moving environment is a skill that you have to work on, right? And it's okay if it's wrong. It's okay. And honestly, as we see here, and as we see with a lot of software, when we write software, we can't know every way that the business is going to use the software in the future, right? We do our best effort to solve the problems in a maintainable way, a testable way. Software engineering is code over time, right? I mean, that really is what we have. And this frames this in a way that I think helps a software engineer think about something that is actually, we actually are set up for success here. We're doing this all the time with the way that we write code or the way we think about product development. But strategy is this sort of like meta systems thinking framework. And again, we'll get into this with the case studies, but you can kind of see how Will always looks for those exponentials, right? He goes, okay, we have this problem. We're not able to do this thing fast enough, but we also know that we're going to hire more people, and hiring more people actually makes it worse. So what do we have to fundamentally change so that hiring more people doesn't make it worse, because we know we have to hire more people, right? So like you basically make this like diagnostic, and you're like, you look at it and you go, yeah, obviously there's like some fundamental shift in how your provisioning resources has to change, or you're going to screech to a halt. And he gives evidence of like, here's the number of tickets that are created, but here's the number of tickets that are closed, right? And there's like,
Right.
there's not a linear correlation between the two, which again shows these problems. I think, even if in that assessment they make a hypothesis that says if we do this, then it'll solve this problem, and then they're wrong, it's okay. You just change the strategy. And that's what your next strategy is talking about. Oh, we thought this was going to actually fix it, but actually it turns out that there's this secondary thing that we didn't know about. And
Okay, let's talk a bit about cope, because I've got some thoughts on this.
okay,
One, we talk about engineering strategy, and like, yeah, engineering strategy has to evolve. I actually think I was seeing someone on Twitter talk about like one of the reasons when you want to like create a startup idea that you want to try to focus as much on like any sort of emergent technology as possible, whether that's, LLMs or VR or, the internet, the iPhone, whatever, is that the whole venture capitalist ecosystem is designed just to pick over any sort of business idea and to judge it worth funding or not worth funding. And so if you have an idea that doesn't capitalize on some sort of emergent new technology, the odds that a venture capitalist has already looked over it and decided this won't work, or funded it and it didn't work, are much higher. That's not an ironclad rule. I think Airbnb is actually a great example. Like, this is a business that was invented like 2009, but there's no reason Airbnb couldn't have been invented in, say, 1999 necessarily, right? Like, sure, phones made it easier, but like the internet is really what made Airbnb possible. So there are counterexamples, but kind of similarly with strategy, if there were like, or it's actually kind of the inverse of strategy, right? Which is that like, if there were some sort of perfect engineering strategy, right? There are so many software engineering leaders out there, right? Someone would have created it by now, and it would just be the time tested strategy that we all use. But that's not the case. Instead, we find we have to keep creating new strategies. And Will Larson encourages us to be easy on ourselves and say, hey, this might have been the right strategy at the time, but as it's gone on, it's no longer the right strategy. And we talk about that with code. You say software engineering is code over time, and systems evolve, and we tried to do the best we could. But isn't there like a lot of cope in that? I say that because right now we are in the middle of a big re-architecture of our system. And I look at the original system, and it's not the worst code base I've ever seen. We had some kind of fundamental constraints with it, but there are some things I look at where I'm like, you know what? Someone with a little more hair on their chest wouldn't have made these mistakes, right? They would have built this thing correctly from the beginning, and now we wouldn't be in this mess. And so kind of the same thing with strategy. You can say like, oh, well, we pivoted, but then we pivoted again and we pivoted again. Like, look, we're just doing strategy. It's just evolving over time. But at what point do you just say like, we made the wrong decisions? This was a poor move. And if we had some sort of knowledge or been more experienced or more talented, we would have gotten it right the first time.
I think there's a survivorship bias. Well, first of all, we will make bad decisions. Like,
right.
I think that is totally possible.
Maybe you will.
Yeah, right. But we look back and go, oh man, what was I thinking? Or it could have been, oh, you know what? 5 nights of skipping sleep and these crazy deadlines of trying to onboard this person. And I was, writing code like a drunken sailor. And that's just how the code is. And that's what we're living with right now, right? Hey, we didn't have the right talent at the time. And this person's incredibly capable in this area, but they were kind of out of their scope. We had some Dunning-Kruger problems, right? But I don't think that all that does to me is beef up the fact that there probably was a lack of formal strategy. Actually, this gets into chapter 13 really well. This is a good tie-in. Strategy testing for iterative refinement. So like chapter 13, I think in 14 and 15 are all in this sort of like advanced tooling for refinement section. And he goes, if I could popularize only one idea about technical strategy, it would be this: prematurely rolling out a strategy prevents you from evaluating whether the strategy is effective. And I think this kind of ties into that piece, which is like, hey, I have an idea. Let's just do it. Right. I think large language models actually make this super cheap to do.
Yeah.
Which is that if you don't give yourself the time to refine something, and it's important strategically, right? Like this is going to be a system that impacts a lot of future decisions. I think that taking that extra moment, that extra beat of testing this as low stakes as possible is is really important. I think that there are some things where like this formal multiple strategy, multiple step strategy stuff doesn't make a lot of sense. But yeah, figuring out the data structures for your API server and like how you're gonna access a bunch of data across entity types and stuff probably needs a beat, right? Probably needs a little bit of thought.
Yeah, we've been talking about that a lot in an LLM world where producing code is now much faster. I mean, how much time now needs to be dedicated to that upfront planning? I think we're going to realize that we are benefiting from some of that friction in the past because you could get started on something and just because it's taking you physically longer to write the code and you might be running into bugs that were more challenging to solve, but that's giving there's time is passing and during that time passing you might be discovering new things about the problem and a completely unrelated to the code, right?
Right.
Or as you're working through the implementation and the implementation is more difficult, right? Like you because like that's the thing, it's like if you're trying to write code and then you're trying to test that code and if that code is hard to test, right, that can kind of cause you to take a beat and you take a moment and you say, wait a minute, are these patterns correct? Is this the right approach here? But with LLMs, you kind of just brute force everything. If it's hard to test, I mean, just have the LLM take another pass or two or three at it. But then it kind of leads to unmaintainable code over the long run.
Right.
I think we've been benefiting from that friction in ways we didn't realize.
I said this when Carl Brown was on. I called it a Dunning-Kruger powered tech debt machine.
Yeah.
If you're not careful, right? So in the reason I say Dunning-Kruger powered tech debt machine is that you don't know, right? Like it's very easy for you to use a large language model to take you out of your domain of expertise. You go, oh man, I don't know much about mobile app development. That's okay. I'll use Claude to help me out. And I do a first pass and it looks pretty good. Partly it looks pretty good because I have Dunning-Kruger, right?
Oh,
Dunning-Kruger
totally.
is this idea that I don't know what I don't know. Where somebody who's probably built mobile apps for years is like, that is the worst structure. In 6 months, you're going to want to shoot yourself because all of the abstractions wrong, right? Or whatever. Because when I look at it in a domain that I am an expert in, right? Like Go, Performant Go API servers or something, right? Like it's something where I actually can scrutinize the code quite well. I'm like, ugh, I mean, you could do it that way. One of the things that we've done that's actually been really helpful, and it's a good use of large language models, is one of the clients that I work with a pretty big chunk of my time right now. We're doing AI augmentation for the whole team. We're trying to like design how we use AI tools collectively. And we've been really settling on this thing called SDD or spec driven development. I don't know if y'all have used this much at.
Not a ton.
Okay, so this is so cool because you basically write a spec that an agent could follow. And what's also nice about it is it's this like we have these FDR, the functional design requirements. We have these high level architecture documents. We're putting really nice documentation and it lives next to the implementation along with a plan and a task list. And I'm not joking. I will spend, hours sometimes, depending on the project, of writing a spec, getting all these ideas together, really, really like figuring out how an agentic sort of like a markdown documentation. And then that gets code reviewed by another human before we even write a real line of code.
Right.
Now there's some things that it's easy enough that I'll do SDD and have the code sitting next to it. And it's just easy enough for me to do this. And as we critique the SDD, as we critique the documentation in the code review process, I'll actually rewrite the code that goes along with it. But I found that this is actually like, it gives me enough of that friction where I have to own this description of how the system should work, the way that I would break the problem down, the way that I would like do it in phases, and then the code that supports it. That it's slowed me down in the short term, but it actually has given me like a really honest way to have a conversation where I'm not, because I'll tell you, I'm very against vibe coding, but under constraints, it's super easy to slip into it where you're just kind of like,
Right, right.
I don't really 100% know what's going on here, but I also don't really care. And then all of a sudden, the code base just slips into something that you're like, you're basically doing open claw where
Right.
you have no idea what's actually being changed as long as the quality gates or whatever are in place, and it's just not a world I want to live in. Um, but it's funny now that I think about it, though. I think I'm going to probably write some skills for because we write skills that the whole team shares, and that helps us with like the craftsmanship for the whole team. I think I might slip in, and those are code reviewed as well. I think I might slip in some of these principles from Will Larson on
Yeah, yeah.
good strategy, because I think a Will Larson style strategy along with our spec driven development is actually be like a good 1-2 punch that we'll experiment with.
Well, we can talk a bit about some of the specific refinement tools he recommends here. There are two: systems modeling and Wardley Maps. We talked a bit about, I think, both of these last week.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about systems modeling because this actually comes from Thinking in Systems by, oh my gosh, Donna something?
Yeah, Donella Meadows.
Donella Meadows, yes. Yes, which is a book we've read. I've been thinking I'm too lazy to like assemble the manual data, but I really want the Book Overflow graph of all the. I want two graphs. I want one which books reference each other, and then in our episodes, what books have we referenced back to. But anyhow, Donnell Meadows, Thinking in Systems. Basically, very high level overview of thinking in systems is that systems are comprised basically out of stocks and flows, roughly. A stock is some sort of resource that can build up, and a flow drains that resource and moves it somewhere else. Very, very high level overview of systems. But he talks about systems modeling and says, hey, this can be an effective tool when trying to refine your engineering strategy. This is one where there are some scenarios where I see this as very, very useful, and there are some scenarios where I think you could gravitate towards like this seeming a little made up. I think this is something that I would not reach for in every conceivable scenario. Now, in the case study for the Uber service provisioning case study, I thought systems modeling was very appropriate here. He basically said, this is how many services we have to provision. This is how many we close out with one engineer manually provisioning them or provisioning them. This is another with two engineers, with three engineers. This is how we think the amount will increase if we continue hiring at the rate we have been. This is how the amount we think will increase if we double our hiring rate, right? And it's kind of it does make for a compelling argument because you can kind of look and say, okay, looking at this system and knowing we can't hire anymore for our specific team, this leads to the inescapable conclusion that we must build an automated way to do this. That makes a lot of sense to me. In less tangible problems like that, like this kind of screams to me like if someone said like, and I've modeled this system and but then it has like very fuzzy numbers, and if your stock is like team morale, right, like I would kind of be like, what is going on here? And I would take your argument less seriously as a result. Will Larson does not argue for that. He does not say this is the silver bullet. If you don't have a systems model, what are you doing? But I could see an engineer reading this and getting excited about the possibility of modeling a system. But I think first I'd encourage you to ask yourselves, do I have something worth modeling? Or do I have something that, if modeled, would yield productive insights?
I like in the section there, he gives some tools, which again, unfortunately, those are the things that are going to get dated in this book over time.
Right.
But I will say also that most of the systems modeling books are also from like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So we read Thinking in Systems, which actually came out in 2008, which that's newer than I thought it was in my mind. But that's right, because I think this was written post. This was after she passed away. I think these are like her notes that she never, if I remember correctly, I think it was her notes in an unfinished book before that her friends helped finish the publication of. Business dynamics, systems thinking, and modeling in a complex world, which sounds very systems thinking-y. And then there's another book he mentions called Introduction to Systems Thinking by Barry Richmond. the reason I bring this up is that the tools meant to work with those are, they're a little bit older, but I think it might just be that they're fine, right? It's okay that some of these, you, not that many people do a formal systems thinking, formal modeling like Will Larson. I've very rarely actually seen this in the wild.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not in the caliber of companies that he's been in, but I think that these are super power tools, and one of the things that can be pretty overwhelming. I've tried doing modeling before, and I've failed at describing things well. And he actually says how to model. Learning to model systems takes practice. So I'll approach the detail of learning to model from two directions. First, by documenting a general approach, and second, by providing breadcrumbs for deeper exploration of models developed in the book. And I think this is a really important thing, which is like, if you're learning to code, right? You don't want to just spin up a React app as your like first coding project. You're probably going to do something that uses like text input in the terminal, that maybe deals with maybe popping items from an array, some really basic things, so you can kind of get a feel for how like data structures work in programming. I think you need to do the same thing for modeling, which is model out some really simple things. Use some tools where you can even if it's like literally draw by numbers type of thing, where like you're like, oh, okay, here's the actual model. Can I build this? Like, do I understand? And if you ask me to build this from scratch, could I build this workflow or whatever? He also gives you some really nice stuff. Like, you can use these formal modeling tools, or use Excalidraw, right? Like, just start with Figma, Whimsical, any of these tools that are just like easy for you to get your hands on. They're not going to have all the power tools or the other kind of cool things. I know a guy that uses something called C4, which is like a formal way of describing complex systems. And he was a software architect, and he actually loves this one called Like C4. And the book here does not talk about these tools at all. But C4 is kind of interesting. Those who get into it are super into it. You can do code generation from it. You can do all these things. It's like beautiful diagrams and graphs. And for him, it was like super intuitive. I've like watched him, pre LLM, just typing stuff out and writing these like beautiful complex things. And I tried it one time, and I was like, I'm an idiot. I don't know how to do anything. What did I do with my life? Like, just like all those things came up, and it's because I hadn't practiced. He's taken a lot of time and energy thinking about how to express his thoughts this way. And so, give yourself some patience, I guess. And yeah.
It's tough because as engineers, we're naturally drawn to be like, oh, this is a cool new thing. I don't know how to do this cool new thing. I should go and do this cool new thing. But I'm with you. It's like, start simple. And I think this is a good tool to have in your tool belt, but I would just caution patience. And out of anything in this book, this was the one thing I read and was like, ugh, like if someone showed up with one of these to a meeting and it wasn't like ironclad, I'd be a little like, what are we doing here? Like,
right.
We're all busy. Like, how long did it take you to make this?
And I will say, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, Mermaid is another common one, and you can embed those into GitHub Markdown. And large language models will gladly generate a Mermaid diagram, and boy, are they ugly. Like most of the time, I'm like, oh, I'll at least get it started, and I'll make some corrections, and I'm like, oh man, why did I do this? I'm just asking myself all kinds of questions in my life. That being said, I've seen other folks who use Mermaid beautifully, right? So I think this is a skill set that I need to spend more time on. One of the things I did love about, again, talking about modeling, there's a couple of quotes. Models are input into a strategy, but never a reliable sole backer. So, this idea of the model isn't the strategy, right? I think that's another way of expressing that. It should support, right? It should support these decisions that you're making. And someone who's good at data visualization, I'm always in awe of it. I've worked with lots of data engineers and data visualization folks. They're like painters with data, right? They understand which type of graph to show, or what kind of things are in place. There's an art to it, even though it's scientifically based. The other quote, the last one I'll say here before I pass the baton is, what systems modeling isn't. I love, again, you know me, I
Yeah.
love like counterfactual stuff. And so when your model and reality conflict, reality is always right. I love that quote, right? It's,
Yeah.
oh, but the model says, you're like, no, doesn't matter. Like in reality, this isn't what's going on.
Doesn't he quotes Jeff Bezos here, doesn't he? Where Jeff Bezos was fond of saying, when anecdotes and data conflict, the anecdotes are usually right.
There
Which
was that
is
famous one where he, like, everyone was like, oh, talking about the customer service numbers.
yeah, they're like, oh yeah, customer service numbers are great. Like,
And
or
he's like, let's call him right now. And so
yeah.
he calls it, and he's like on hold for, they were like, oh, the amount of time you're on hold has gone down. And he's on hold for, minutes or whatever. And
Yeah.
it sucked. And he's just like, okay, well, in this case, it wasn't. And I just called in, and we need to fix this.
Yeah.
So,
I know. I think yeah, I know there's that's an interesting example right there, because it's a little, I would be frustrated if my boss did that to me. Like if I were like, hey, website latency is, like we have a P50 of, 80 milliseconds and our P99 is 170 milliseconds. And then he's like, okay, let me load the website right now. And then it took 3.5 seconds to load. But then we looked and it was just a spike, like a momentary spike at that, right then. And you were like, no, well, the website's obviously not working, so get to work on that, right?
right.
So yeah, but I do see a little more like I've heard stories with like customer satisfaction, where it's like, oh, we're reporting customer satisfaction of 98%, but then you get an email from a customer that's like, hey, I had a really negative experience with this. And that leads you to ask a little more like, well, are we measuring customer satisfaction the right way? Or are we only, or maybe we are measuring it the right way, but the only people responding to our customer satisfaction surveys are the people who are satisfied, right?
Right. Or is that 2%, is it just kind of like, it's mostly fine, but, I don't know of a better tool. And, when it breaks, it's kind of annoying. Or is the 2% so bad that that's like all of your churn, right? Like, it's
Absolutely,
like you
right.
drop the ball, never using this again, telling all my friends never to use it again. Like
Yeah.
that 2% is a very different 2%.
Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Mailtrap, a modern email delivery platform built for developers. Mailtrap gives you native SDKs for straightforward integration, a security-compliant API and SMTP, and a free tier with 4,000 emails a month to get started. And when you need help, you're talking to a real person, not an AI chatbot. Check them out at mailtrap.io.
Well, let's talk about Wardley Maps. That's that rounds out kind of the official material, not official material, but everything before the case studies, right? Wardley Maps. Yeah, he's high on Wardley Maps.
It's the white whale. It's the white whale.
Talk to us about Wardley Maps, Nathan.
Wordly Maps, so it's these two-dimensional diagrams. They're very recognizable once you see them. And I'll say there's actually some really cool web-based tools that are out for these now. But so basically you have the y-axis is less visible to the user and down at 0. And then as you go up, it's more visible to the user. So the top of this grid would be things like, I think they were talking about AI enhanced documentation
I've got it right.
Or something. Yeah. So there's an author and a reader, right? Like those are your two and you could think of these as like archetypes or user types if you're in like the product world. So these are the people using this. So whatever's closest to them on the Wordly Map is the most visible, right? They actually see this content creation interface, right? Or they read the content on your website, right? Or whatever. And then those things can live on a continuum on the x-axis, which Genesis, which means it's completely novel. The world has never seen this. You've created some brand new thing. It's, you straight up own it. And then it becomes custom, right? You've customized something that exists. It's a product, meaning that, this is something thing that you build that is unique product. And then commodity, right? Commodity being that off the shelf, you don't even think about it twice, right? And so I think in this one Wordly Map that's like mapping AI enhanced document editing, a document reader would be under commodity, right? So it's not, so the user reads content, maybe there's some like a little bit of custom stuff that's like makes it pleasant to read, but the document reader piece that's like reading data off of your systems or whatever, that's probably just some library. You don't even think twice about it. It's, your MDX rendering system or whatever, right? That is like taking interactive markdown and putting it somewhere. Where maybe something that's like in this Wordly map, a search index, right? Search index is maybe there's some novel way that you're doing search indexing because it's a large language model. You have to have RAG, databases and all this kind of crazy stuff. It's pretty custom, right? Like you've taken a lot of things and you've customized it to what works well for your workflow. So it's less visible, like not visible to the customer, because they're not thinking about your search index, but they are thinking when they type something in, it just works, right? And so you kind of map all of this stuff out of all the things that you have that make your system work, the connections between them, and it helps you understand like what are the real valuable things. What you can even describe these where teams maybe own certain parts of your Wordly Map system, and I don't know. It gives you this really nice. You also can give these flows. It's very common in a Wordly map, where maybe we have like a document editor that's over here in like somewhere between like custom and product, right? And we want to maybe commoditize it. So meaning over time, we don't want to be running our document editor. We really just want it to be some commodity document editor. Like we're moving towards this direction. And so that's the Wordly maps can also show like movement over time of like some part of the system. And again, it actually, it's a really nice way of seeing the complexity of a complex system from a user facing standpoint. And I think the point of a Wordly map, at least my understanding of them, is that the more visible something is, the more weight that this user has, right? Like the way that part of the system behaves. And then there's lots of supporting invisible things that might be important to the business, but if you're not changing anything positively for the visible part, it's not really well understood.
I hope to have the opportunity one day to make a Wardley map that proves useful. Like I agree with the philosophy behind a Wardley map. I think this is like prime behind like the classic mistakes people engineering organizations make, which is like, let's build our own markdown rendering engine, right? Let's build our own operating system. Let's build our own distributed messaging queue, right? And like you want to do that as an engineer because that's fun and because the constraints and the challenges associated with that are purely technical challenges, and it's pretty easy to find like, does this work? But like when you look at a Wardley map, it's very much like, how visible is this to the users? I mean, it's way down at the bottom, right? And so anything that's down at the bottom, you should be pushing more and more towards the commodity side of things. And so to me, those feel like just good instincts to have as an engineer or an engineering leader. And a Wordley map visually depicts those instincts. I'm just trying to figure out the scenario where like a Wordley map would be like really, really useful.
So we read Team Topologies, and what's interesting is, from what I've heard, is that version 2 of Team Topologies, the one that we haven't read yet, actually gives a whole section on Wordly maps when it comes to flow for teams. And so one of the things that they talk about, there's like a map overview showing which teams owns which capabilities, right? So one of the things that I think can help with a Wordly map is you go, hey, our company is fixating on this part of the product, but I'm warning you, it's invisible to the end user. And we are spending a tremendous amount of engineering resources because it's all custom code, right?
Yeah.
And if you see like, hey, why isn't the infrastructure engineering team solving all these other problems? You're like, well, actually, you've put search index on their plate, and it's super invisible and super custom code, and it's like super labor intensive, right? If that's our secret sauce, this is why we need to maybe hire separately. But so this idea of like, what's occupying times for teams?
I see. Yeah.
What's core business? And again, it's a very strategic thing. And again, if you don't write a good one, it's kind of BS. But if you're trying to use it to help identify like, why are we stuck? Why is there friction?
Yeah.
And so I think it can be useful. And I'm saying this from a theoretical standpoint. I've never used a Wordly map in the wild, right? I've tried to start modeling. I'm actually working on a data project right now where I do think that we've got a lot of moving parts. We're trying to, we have this company that I'm doing stuff with. They're doing a bunch of stuff in Excel, very manual, super smart folks, but it's super labor intensive and error prone because they're using Excel and macros and
Mhm.
stuff. And we want to, that's all under, Genesis custom level stuff, super slow. The wrong people are working on it, that could be doing other finance type stuff. And so what I want to do is a Wardley map that shows the processes, what's visible and what's not, and then how can we move it towards commodity. And I don't know of a better way of visualizing it than a Wardley map, even
Right,
though
right.
I'm a newbie in describing this. And so, yeah, it's not like solves all your problems. To me, it's really helps when you're talking about how you structure your teams, the things that you're actually building, and then where are we spending our time? Are we spending all of our time on invisible things that are super custom, or can we make our team more focused on the stuff that's right there in the user's face? And so, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah, when are Wordly maps useful is actually an interesting section. And he's like, no tool is universally effective.
Right.
He said Wordly maps are extremely helpful at helping people understand a broad change. They're less helpful with details. And so, I think that is, if you're trying to persuade folks being like, this team is spending all of its time on custom code, or this team is, um, we have all these invisible processes with all these teams dedicated to these invisible processes. I think it can be super, super valuable.
Yeah. And talking about how they help deal with change, he says, for example, in the early 2010s, startups like Facebook, Uber, and Dig were all operating in physical data centers with their own hardware. Over the next 5 years, as cloud-based infrastructure rapidly expanded, having a presence in a physical data center went from the default approach for startups to a relatively unconventional solution. Any strategy written in 2010 that imagined the world of hosting as static was destined to be invalidated. So, you could imagine kind of building a Wardley map of like, yeah, like you're trying to reevaluate and be like, okay, we've been doing our own on-prem stuff for a while. We're moving to a data center approach. Let's take stock of the landscape, right? Let's figure out at this point what has been commoditized, what hasn't been. I mean, we'll probably see this with LLMs, right? Where like, I bet there are companies right now that have spent a decent amount of time investing in these like agentic harnesses to really turbocharge their LLMs, which honestly have probably already been eaten by Claude Code. I think will only continue. I think now the big question is kind of like multi-agent orchestration, right? Because like you kind of have to do that to pave over the context window problems. And I bet there are companies out there right now investing a lot in these kind of complex
Yep.
multi-agent orchestration workflows that I bet will be commoditized in 3 years
Yeah.
max.
Anywhere that there's high pain but high value,
Yep.
those are on path to be commoditized, right? Again, perfect example is that you look at companies like Vercel, right?
Yeah.
Vercel sits on top of AWS, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could argue that they're charging a premium on type of it. And I think the way that certain workloads are set up, it would be super expensive. But if most of your stuff is scale to zero, I don't want to think about my DevOps pipeline type work. Vercel takes a lot of pain away, and it actually
Yeah.
prevents you from making a lot of bad decisions. I think the same thing is going to happen with like, there's going to be companies where you're going to do a brute install of some agentic harness where you've got spend scale to zero serverless agentic tools where it's super safe, it's isolated, it's not going to take over your machine, it's not going to do these things, but it's going to feel just like Cloud Code local or whatever. And actually, I just saw this recently. Claude just announced that they've got their own like open claw kind of alternative where you can now use Claude Code where you can talk to it through like WhatsApp or Telegram.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wild, right? So again, and I would imagine that it's a much more measured way of approaching it, where you don't have to like YOLO your whole life on a Mac Mini. These things are going to go from being novel in Genesis to commodity, right? I think that's absolutely true, and that's true. We read in the Plex. Google had to figure out how to transition from a couple of servers in a rack at Stanford or whatever into starting to provision data centers. Most startups these days don't have that at all, right? Most startups these days are just going to go pick a cloud provider and not have to deal with scaling infrastructure and writing, doing like custom data center design until they're pretty big, right?
Right.
You don't have to worry about data centers until you're a big company now, because of how easy it is to get that off the ground. And it used to be that if early 2000s, you had to have data center designers and all kinds of stuff to make your company work.
Well, let's talk just a bit about the case studies. We don't have a ton of time,
Mm-hmm.
but we've kind of talked a bit about them throughout the episode, and obviously the case studies are just showcasing what we've learned in the book so far. I'll just highlight again. I really liked the Uber service migration case study, talking about the need for. This was when Uber was in the process of migrating off of their monolith onto new microservices per team. And yeah, I thought this was a very effective use of systems modeling, showing that like, hey, at this pace, like our current trajectory is unsustainable. We need a new way off of this. And this was also a really great case study showcasing how to do strategy at a lower level. Now, this is interesting because the top level strategy was already set at Uber, which was like, we're getting off the monolith, we're moving towards independent systems. But this shows how an individual team can be effective in accelerating a strategy by just making the actual operational parts of it easier. Yeah, so I mean, good case study, and we've talked about a lot of the concepts throughout the episode already.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, these things don't make a lot of sense for us to go play by play, other
Right, right.
than sort of highlights. I will say it's, again, from a time capsule standpoint. There's a shout out to a tool, unless called Fabricator, and it's spelled with a
Oh, yeah.
PH. Have you ever had run into
I know of
Fabricator?
Fabricator, but never
Yeah, so
used it.
I worked in one startup that used it, and I was just like, "What?" It's like a Silicon Valley lore sort of thing. Folks who used it with success, but it's an alternative to GitHub for doing code reviews and stuff. So you use it. It's got some really nice features that don't exist in GitHub. Like, for instance, if I do a code review and I make a few little updates, it's super easy to see the diff from when I last reviewed somebody's code to where they made changes. So I can just see what they did in response to my code review. And you can do this in GitHub, but it's like not easy. Um, it's just super intuitive and basic, and it does a bunch of other things too. And it had a ticketing system. The only problem is it's like it became an open source project and basically unmaintained. Um, but it's just funny because I was just like, oh yeah, good old Fabricator days. Um, but there's other ones, right? Garrett. There's a few others out there, but again, you want to, most of these tools these days, you want to just use the commodity version of them.
Well,
Excellent Wardley diagram with that Uber one as well. I think they showed where they have like um, Puppet plus Clusto, and I think Clusto is something that came out of the Dig thing. And again, you'll see
yeah.
these like little stories, and they're like, okay, these served us for a time, but it's not where we want to be in the future, and we want to move this towards serverless cloud provisioning stuff. Um, and so the Wardley map kind of shows this invisible piece that's transitioning from product into commodity, right? And I think it's a good way of backing up this. Here's our strategy. We're doing all these things. It's going to do this stuff, and it's also going to reduce the burden of this one like custom code base that we have.
Well, do you want to talk about the next case study, or I think it's a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah, no. Again, I highly recommend, like, you've gotten this, if you've gotten this far in the book, and if you listen to like what we're saying, these case studies are going to be really familiar, right? I think if we had started looking at the case study and I didn't have a framework for thinking about what makes a good written strategy, I'd have been like, okay, this is pretty dry. I don't know what I'm looking at. But now that I have these tools and I'm like, oh yeah, this is well argued. Like, here's the policy portion, and here's the diagnostics, and I understood why it's like set out the way it is. Um, they're fun to read. Again, I know that sounds insane, but it's not. These are good sections. I think there's a couple more case study chapters that we have, and then they're going to finish out the book with like, where do you go from here kind of stuff, which I think is going to be a nice arc for next week.
This is I'm actually just reading right now because you mentioned, you said Clusto came out of Dig, or was Fabricator out of Dig?
No, I think Clusto came out of Dig.
Clusto was out of Dig.
Yeah, roast me
I was
if
like,
I'm
God.
wrong.
No, I was like, Dig, whatever happened to Dig? And so I was like, I know Dig kind of had their big redesign, and that kind of drove all the traffic to Reddit. I didn't realize, but just like 2 months ago, the founder of Dig, they bought Dig back from whoever purchased Dig in like the fire sale. And with the founder of Reddit, and they launched 2 months ago, and just like 6 days ago, they shut down again. So poor Dig. They said the bot problem was terrible. So anyhow, sad little side note about Dig there. Let's move on. We got, as far as hot takes, I mean, I've given mine throughout the episode. I think, look, don't make a systems model unless you're really confident that's a good systems model. I think this is just like I read this great little essay on Twitter called Tool Shaped Objects, which is about this idea that like there are some objects there are some quote unquote tools which are theoretically supposed to be tools and make you more productive, but are actually just fun to use. And so basically the market for seeming productive is actually bigger than the market for being productive, right? He actually talks about like Farmville and says like Farmville, like no matter where you click on the screen, your farm is going to grow, right? And he was likening large language models to this, where he says like large language models are both a tool and a tool-based or a tool-shaped object. He says a good sign for like if you are dealing with a tool-shaped object is when you're talking more about how much you're using the tool than what you're building with it. And so that's the thing with LLMs is like it's both. It's like we can build really cool things with it, but at the same time, you see people bragging about like, I thought it was so bizarre when OpenAI started handing out like those awards for like token spend. It's like that seems bad. You don't want to spend tokens, right? Like
imagine the electric company being like, this is your lifetime kilowatt hours usage.
Yes. Like, exactly, right? Bizarre. Anyway, Wardley Maps strike me, or not Wardley Maps. Systems modeling strikes me a little about someone who wants to feel like I'm doing strategy. I'm being productive. I made this systems model.
I definitely think that you could, and he does talk about this at the beginning. Do not cargo cult with this, and I think that you're right. I think it's very alluring. Or even Cal Newport talks about this with busyness theater, right? It's it's like if I act like I've got this stuff, but there's a famous thing to say like fake it till you make it. Don't do that with strategy. Like don't fake your strategy until you make it. Like if you don't have a good strategy to contribute that has a good model of how the world works, because one of the things that you're probably going to do is make a bad strategy that sounds very convincing, and that's a waste of everyone's time for sure.
Yeah, it's we're just in the middle of this big rewrite, and I keep kind of with the team. I've been trying to practice like tell them and then tell them that you told them, right? And something I keep trying to reemphasize that like, listen, there's so much work to do here. We're going to be productive. Everyone is going to spend every day writing code and making some part of our system better. We're all smart engineers. We're just going to do that. But are we building the right things? And maybe more importantly, are we building the right things fast enough? And one of the reasons I harp on that so much is because I have fallen victim to this in the past. And that's why I gave Slow Productivity in 2024. I said that was my favorite book of the year because I felt called out in like this pseudo productivity is what he calls it, right? This idea that like you're doing things that like theoretically like it's work and there are things that need to get done, but is it actually moving the needle? And so just a word of caution on my end with any sort of engineering strategy is like you got to move the needle and don't latch onto like the easy part, snacking as Will Larson would call it in his other book, Staff Engineer. So not that Will Larson encourages that, but recognizing that tendency in myself, I thought.
No, absolutely. And yeah, I think the other one with LLM, somebody brought this up really well, which is that the similarity between LLMs and 3D printers, right? And I think I brought this up in other podcast episodes, which is most 3D printer owners end up doing like at least this is what I've seen. they end up 3D printing modifications for their 3D printer. Like, oh, I need this clip so that this wire hooks out better, right? You end up using the 3D printer a lot for your 3D printer.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is a lot like, oh, I have all these skills that I've been working on for my large language model. And you're like, okay. And then the other one is like, or you're just like, make your 3D printing tchotchkes, right? Like you like, oh, you made a, you know, Iron Man mask at, you know, lifelike, the actual size of the Iron Man mask. And you're like, that's cool. Like, I'm glad you did that. But like, you know, I remember when the 3D printers came out, and it was like, oh yeah, you know, manufacturing's going to get this, you know, distributed to everywhere, and you're going to be able to like print replacement parts for your car and all this other stuff. And I'm like, very few people actually do that, even though 3D printers are amazing. Like, I'm not discounting how cool a 3D printer is, but you actually have to be pretty skilled to be able to use one. And I think large language models are a lot like that, where it's like, yes, anything is possible, but very few things are practical. And you really actually have to be pretty skilled to use them in an effective way.
Well, what about you? You got any hot takes?
Hot takes. Oh man, Wardley Maps look super cool. At least I think they look super cool. They are so hard to rate. I've just tried to make some, and I'm like, this is a clown show. I don't know what I'm doing, and so I just need to get better at. He has some really good strategies on how to like breadcrumb in and the multi-pass sort of doing pieces. And I think if I get better at making a Wordly map, I'm going to be better at thinking about organizational flow in general. And so I've carved out some time to do this. Yeah.
What about what are you going to do differently in your career?
Inverting the document structure. Goodness. I've definitely gotten some strategy stuff, but I've actually looked at something that I wrote just a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, yes, if I had inverted the structure the way that he outlined, I think it would have been a much more effective document for others to read. So I'm going to, I have one strategy document coming up on like how we're going to approach a new problem, with some, you know, proposals on how to do this. And I think I'm going to apply this to that. What about you?
For me, like, listen, I want to, in the spirit of the podcast, I want to have something real here. But to be honest, like I did a lot of engineering strategy about 6 weeks ago to come up with kind of like our re-architecture. And we're just now in the thick of it. And we have entered kind of squarely the trough of sorrow with any big project, or, you know, right?
You'll get through it. You're going to get through it.
We're going to get through it. It's going well. And the database migration is done. And that was like a beast. And then we got the front end migration done. We're basically like, our front end components were really tightly coupled to the GraphQL implementation. And so just to even be able to switch to the new service, which will be REST based, we had to introduce that kind of migration seam and decouple it. So we got all of that done now. And we've really invested in like our Cloud Code skills to be able to analyze the existing functionality and to, you know, get us a good V1 version of it that we can then review. And so we have all of that. And now we just have to start, like, now it's entering production, which is scary, right? And so we're going to do it. I spent all day yesterday load testing the new system because that was a thing. I'm like, this thing's got to be able to handle load better. That's why we're doing all of it. And my initial results were much better than the previous system, but I was a little like, oh, geez, like this isn't as good as I wanted. And then the more I looked into it, I'm like, oh, I think I chose the single worst endpoint we've written so far. It was like 6 SQL queries that it's like 2 batches or 3 batches of 2 each. Each query was kind of complicated on its own, and like, and then so I started testing it with some simpler endpoints, and I was getting the performance I wanted out of it. I'm like, amazing. Okay, good. Like this is what we're wanting. Anyhow, all that to say, I got to make it through this re-architecture.
You're gonna do it. I believe
we're gonna do it. Yeah. Okay. And then, yeah, as far as who you recommend the book to, for me, same as last week. If you're in leadership or adjacent to leadership, again, would I recommend to the juniors? Me personally, not so much. But it's it's a good book. I think you like this a little more than I do, but I think that's fine.
This is a top 5 book for me, which is pretty hard to get into that list. I'm going to say like it's going to be up there with Fundamentals of Software Architecture and Philosophy of Software Design, just because I think it rounds out. If you're on a path in which you want to go, you know, Staff Plus, you really like this, and either you're going to go staff plus or you're going to go into management. Thinking strategically is so valuable, and understanding how to interact with folks who are thinking strategically, right? The other part of this book is when you inevitably run into a Will Larson, who's the next up and coming Will Larson. If you want to more effectively talk to a person like this, you need to also understand what their motivations are here. Why are they thinking this way? Why are they thinking in systems? If that's interesting to you, it is. I haven't seen it tackled this way, even though aspects of it are in fundamental software architecture, aspects of it are in team topologies. It's easy to recommend. It is, is it going to be worth your time if you want to, if you read the first chapter and you're like, ooh, this is right up my alley, the book's going to pay off. Right.
Yeah, this will be one that's widely read for a while.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, we will wrap up next week with our closing thoughts on the whole book. It's going to be mostly case studies. Interested to see how the episode goes. I think it'll lead to a lot of interesting discussion. And as always, you can find us on our website, bookoverflow.io. Check that out if you haven't. Nathan, I'm really impressed. It's looking really cool these days.
Oh yeah, we just added most of the, or at least all of the most recent episodes. I'm backfilling the rest of them. You have to, but we have episode transcripts that are from our recordings, and it includes timestamps that you can click into the YouTube videos. And so not only can you search for like if we've ever talked about, how many times has Carter mentioned the word Disney, right? You can go find every episode where the auto transcript, creator has put it there. So if you remembered, oh man, didn't they talk about this thing this one time? You can go search for it now. And if it's in the last like 50, 60 episodes, it's there. We're working on getting the rest of them in there too. But yeah, we're going to keep trying to add stuff. Hopefully this also helps with like search engine optimization. Maybe someone's curious about something, they find an episode. So yeah. Let us know how you like it.
Yeah, and you can always contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. You can find us on Twitter at bookoverflowpod. I'm on Twitter at Carter Morgan. And Nathan and his newsletter with his consulting agency, Rojo Roboto, is at rojoroboto.com/newsletter. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll see you later.